ETV. Funding for Firing Line is made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Annenberg Foundation and the Friends of Firing Line.
To examine the anti-terrorism bill passed by the Senate by a lopsided majority in June. It was outspokenly a reaction to the bombing in Oklahoma City. The question has arisen, do some of the bill's provisions go too far? It is the conviction of several of our guests here that the answer is yes. They are Ira Glasser, well known as the Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union, Professor David Cole, a professor of law at Georgetown University Law School here in Washington, and Jim Zogby, who is director of the American Arab Institution. Approving the bill are Victoria Tensing with the law firm of Manat, Phelps, and Phillips in Washington, and Steve Emerson, a journalist and author who is specialized in a study of terrorism. Michael Kinsley, the well-known author and journalist, is here to deliberate both sides of the argument. Let me begin by asking Mr. Zogby whether he believes that the impulse behind the bill was directed at terrorism in the Near East.
I think most certainly from the rhetoric that was used, the findings that were presented in the introduction to the legislation, from the comments of the President himself. It was an effort, I think, a mistaken effort, actually, designed to support the peace process by combating terrorism and the sources of funding of terrorism. He described it from here in the United States to support terrorism in the Middle East. I think the findings are wrong. I think that the impulse is wrong. I think it's hurtful to my community because it is based not on fact, but rather on fear and to some extent fiction.
I think we all acknowledge that it was at first supposed that the bad guys were from the Near East, because Near East is plagued by the problem, just as it was supposed after the assassination of Kennedy that it was done by sort of a right-wing butcher.
Yeah, but let me respond to that, because the fact is that that assumption is based on a racial prejudicial notion of Arabs and Muslims and what they're about. For sure, there are acts of terrorism that have occurred in the Middle East, but look at the State Department's own findings. Anti-U.S. violence, anti-U.S. terrorism around the world, 1994, Latin America is great.
I wasn't talking about anti-U.S., I was talking about terrorism.
But the fact is, terrorism, this is attacks on the U.S. The assumption behind Oklahoma City was that it was an attack against the U.S., and therefore it had to be Arab and Muslim.
The people who looked at Oklahoma City said, who did it? Then they asked the question, well, who's engaged in a lot of terrorism?
And the answer is that the predominant acts of terrorism, both in this country and against the United States around the world, and period around the world, are not Middle Eastern in origin. So let's understand that the instinct to accuse Arabs first is based on a prejudicial assumption, and that's what's hurtful.
Terrorism goes on in Rwanda, but I do know that an awful lot of terrorism goes on in the Near East, and it's a perfectly logical...
look at the findings. The findings don't comport with that assumption.
Okay, therefore, I was misinformed to the extent I am so with the American people. I'm just telling you,
yes.
I'm introducing you to the American people. That's what they thought.
One of the interesting things about the reaction, I think, is that even when the facts become clear, that it's not an immigrant, that it's a domestic threat, the bill that is proposed is directed primarily at immigrants, primarily at quote-unquote foreign terrorism. And I think this is a pattern that we've seen in the past. At the turn of the century, President McKinley was assassinated by Leon Czolgosz because his name sounded foreign. Notwithstanding the fact that he was a U.S. citizen, how did we respond? We responded by putting into place, for the first time ever, exclusions of aliens from this country based on their espousing anarchist views. The Palmer raids in the 1920s. The Palmer raids were a response to a series of bombings. There was no evidence that the bombings were done by aliens. Nonetheless, the Justice Department responded by going out and on one weekend arresting 6,000 aliens, throwing them into detention centers, beating many of them, and ultimately about 200 of them were deported, but not for bombing, but for their association with a politically disfavored. So we've done this in the past. We focus our attention on immigrants.
It is these political impulses that I think it would be fruitful to explore. It's true that in 1920, it was about a year and a half after they'd executed all the Tsar and his wife and his children, and that the communists, anarchists were a worldwide movement, and there was that overreaction. It's also true that after Pearl Harbor, we took 60,000 was it American Japanese,
100,000.
And stuck them in detention camps. And that, interestingly enough, the Attorney General of California was Earl Warren at that time.
And it's always easier to, I think the point is, it's always easier to lash out against immigrants, against people who we don't think are like us. And much of this bill is directed at that. Nothing in this bill is directed at the political activities of the militias. What it's directed at is the political activities of domestic groups that are doing solidarity work with organizations.
There's a lot in this bill that's directed at, for instance, how many times you can appeal. That's not a political activity.
Yes, but that also has nothing realistically to do with terrorism. That habeas corpus provision, which
that was the opportunism.
Right. You would concede that.
Yeah. What we're talking about is that a provision of the bill says that habeas corpus has to be limited to sort of one time out.
One bite at the apple.
Yeah.
And the opportunism here, I think, is worth exploring, because aside from the points about people who are not like us that David and Jim have raised, we are in the beginning of a presidential campaign. And my view about what is driving this is in the wake of Oklahoma City, and most of the candidates will admit this candidly if you talk to them quietly, what they are deathly afraid of, and that's true of Clinton, and it's true of Dole, and it's true of most of them. They don't want to be in the position of running for president and in September of 1996 and have another bomb go off and have their opponents say, why didn't you do something? So they all want to do something. And in their haste to do something, it doesn't matter if they do something wrong, because...
Well, it matters to me.
Well, it should matter to all of us, but it doesn't matter to them.
No, I think it's... Yeah, I'm very skeptical about politicians. But when 91 senators think this would advance the interests of the United States, I don't think it's exactly correct to say that this is purely political opportunism.
100 senators
a lot of them were...
the Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor bill.
That wasn't legislative act.
Unanimity. No, but they all supported it.
But if the impending election was the driving force, why is it slowed to a crawl to the point that some people are actively predicting, including myself, that this may die in the Senate and House later this year?
Good point.
It's slowed to a crawl for a very interesting reason, which is opposition from the far right, not from far leftists and civil libertarian traditions.
National Rifle Association types? Is it,
not just that, but the growth of the militia. This is not a completely undesirable development. I think Ira would probably agree that there has been awakened on the right and the reasonably far right of a greater appreciation for civil liberties, in part because they feel, either rightly or wrongly, that the government is out to get them, which they didn't partly. I think it's partly because there happens to be a Democratic administration, frankly, but for whatever reason, the right is, if I don't think Ira and his forces could stop this bill. They totally failed. What slowed it down and may stop it is opposition on the right, which is interesting.
It also shows that the legislation itself isn't just directed at immigrants. In other words, it's directed at everyone. And I think this goes to the point that you asked in the very beginning.
Yeah.
The legislation itself it was introduced before the Oklahoma bombing, and it was basically derived...
Some of it was.
Most of it was, right?
Yeah.
No. There was a bill called the Omnibus Anti-Terrorist Bill that Clinton introduced before the Oklahoma City bombing, which was more narrowly focused. It was an overbroad bill, but it did not have the breathtaking scope of this bill. This bill was an amalgam of that one plus bills that were introduced in the wake of Oklahoma City, which would never have been
certainly
introduced.
These were a lot of provisions that had been around.
Well, sure, but that's what Oklahoma City was a pretext for saying, let's take everything out of the closet that we haven't been able to get through before, and we feared
The
to get it.
legislation was first proposed, following on the heels of an executive order that the president issued describing some groups as terrorist and therefore limiting outlawing fundraising for them. He then promised legislation to codify that and to enlarge
Why
upon
does it
it.
matter who hit Willie? I mean, my
fact is
my
legislation
thesis
Let Ms.
is
Tenson say what she wants
my
to say.
thesis is that these bills can be much needed, and yet they will sit around until some kind of horrible act occurs, and then they ride the
Well, the argument
train
is, are they
through the
needed?
legislature. But well, I want to go back a minute because the old lawyer researcher in me has a hard time with your chart. I want to know, with your chart, where does Pan Am 103, with over 100 and some dead Americans, sit in that? Is it just the number of attacks, so that Pan Am 103 shooting down is only one incident, and it is equated with some kind of small bombing that actually never went off?
Well, if your argument is with the State Department, if your argument is with the State Department, bring it up with them because they have a number of charts in the back of their book.
There's a valid reason to
I
have
would agree with you.
information as to how many attacks occur.
I would agree with you.
But there's also, I bet the State Department has another chart.
They do,
that
on
tells
victims.
how many victims
Right.
there
And in
are,
every
and it might
instance,
be different.
in every instance, attacks from the Middle East pale in the face of attacks that take place against the U.S., terrorist attacks against the U.S. in Latin America.
I think we
and the
can't
same
deny
is true
certain facts,
when you look at
though,
domestic
and that
issues
is
of
that
terrorism.
in the Mideast is generally responsible for Pan Am 103.
Talk to the State Department and get the book.
How 270 died in Pan Am 103. Well, I can't think of how many people have died in attacks on Americans by Latin American guerrilla force, terrorist forces. I can't. I'm sure there have been some, but I can't think of any. So name me 10 or 20, let alone 270.
Well, what they've had a lot of in Latin America is kidnappings. Terrorist kidnappings during the 70s and 80s.
But these are 94 and 93.
I'd be surprised it came to 283.
These are 94 and 93. I have the two most recent reports.
The bottom line, when Mr. President proposed the executive order in January of this year freezing the assets of terrorist groups, I think there were 18 groups. I think 16 of them were Arab or Muslim militants. The other two were Jewish groups.
There were 12 groups,
okay.
and 10 were Arab Muslim and 2 were Jewish.
Now, that in itself was not a racist act. It was not a McCarthyite act. That was a fact of life. There is a veritable terrorist threat. There are militant Islamic groups. They have penetrated the United States in terms of establishing networks. Saying that is not a racist statement. We recognize that. We also recognize that they are unrepresentative of the larger Muslim community. However, the legislation is designed to stop that small, narrow fringe of extremists, whether they be Islamic or Jewish or any other religion.
Or native.
What?
Or native.
Well, yes, but I think that the bill itself initially was generated more by the threat of these extremist groups coming in from the outside. And now I think it's been readapted to accommodate the current threat in the United States.
The executive order was wrong. It was wrong for the reason that was offered, to support the peace process. That is not the way to support the peace process. We want the peace process to work, but we do not feel that this particular way of doing it is going to do anything other than delegitimize those who in fact support the process.
Those were terrorist groups.
Number two, limiting financial support for the humanitarian, not just the humanitarian activities of Hamas and other groups listed, but humanitarian activity of groups affiliated with, related to, or groups that somehow may have on their board of directors a member of Hamas or the Democratic Front or something like that. That is going to be hell to implement. It's going to prove, I think, very detrimental to the civil liberties of people in this country, and it's basically not workable, and it's going to hurt. The fact is, though, is that if you look at face value, the number of acts of violence committed in this country by Arabs or Muslims pale in the face of those committed by others, and yet the executive order is limited to Middle Eastern related. The argumentation about this particular legislation is limited to Arabs and Muslims.
Why don't you accept
and the fact is that it ought to look in other parts of the world. It ought to look in Central American or Puerto Rican or Cuban or Jewish, which is 16, but very few acts, namely 3, have occurred in this country on the hands of Arabs.
Does the bill say this is only targeted against Muslims?
The executive order does.
No, but the executive order has nothing to do with the bill. The bill doesn't say we're going against Muslims.
Findings that were presented in the opening of the bill are largely Arab and Muslim.
I think it's worth looking at how the administration enforced the previous counterterrorism legislation, because there has been anti-terrorism legislation on the books for some years now, And in a case that I'm involved in Los Angeles, we have got a judge to grant a preliminary injunction on the ground that the government has selectively prosecuted the anti-terrorism provisions against Palestinian immigrants. We showed that there were immigrants who were supporting the unlawful activities, violent activities, terrorist activities of the Contras and of the Mujahideen at the very same time that the government sought to deport 8 Palestinians, 7 Palestinians and a Kenyan woman in Los Angeles for supporting lawful activities of a group designated as terrorists.
Why is this so?
Why is it so? Because when you pass a law that is as broad as this, that defines terrorism, this bill defines terrorism as any use of explosive or weapon with intent to endanger another person except for financial gain. So virtually any violent crime is terrorism. When you define a bill that broadly and make people deportable or criminally punishable for supporting any such organization, there are thousands of such organizations.
David, there is a reason,
and what happens then is you get selective prosecution. It's not possible to prosecute all the people who are supporting lawful.
The prosecutors you're talking about were pre this bill, obviously.
Right, but they're
what was the motive in the selectivity there?
The motive in the selectivity was that the government stated what its motive was. It wanted in papers that have been turned over to us now as a result of the order of the court, it stated that it wanted to disrupt the political activities of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine in the Los Angeles area. It also stated, William Webster stated, that our clients had not engaged in any terrorist activities whatsoever or supported any terrorist activities.
It's not so much racism as it is political bias. These are the Contras and the Mujahideen are our terrorists. Our terrorists.
But that's a very separate issue from the other one that you brought out, which is that any violent crime can be terrorism. There's a very good legal prosecutive reason for that. And that is, whenever a person goes to court as a prosecutor and has to prove a crime, then you have to prove the elements of the crime. 1, 2, 3, whatever they are, you have to prove the elements. No prosecutor wants to go in and prove that somebody committed a crime because they wanted to coerce a government or whatever all these, highfalutin definitions of terrorism are. So we made a decision, a policy decision in the 1980s that we would make the the Justice Department when I was there developing the terrorism section, that we would keep the violent crimes as the basic crimes of terrorism, and then we would have the Attorney General certify whenever she or he thought that this was a crime of terrorism. That way, we did not have to get into some kind of complicated, convoluted crime that we had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
And it's precisely that has gotten about this bill that has gotten the right wing opposed to it. Because what this bill would do is make the House bill, which is where it's gotten tied up, would make every crime of passion into a terrorist offense, which would federalize every crime of passion a federal offense, which would federalize.
John Jones kills Mrs. Jones because she catches her in bed with him, and that becomes
that's the precise example.
That's so misleading.
David, as you know,
that's the precise example
that definition. Look, there are provisions of the bill that will be changed as it goes through the process.
Every time we raise a concern about people say, well,
the chairman of the committee's already said that he's going to be changing it, and he's going to be, I can't guarantee that he'll be doing it, but this is what he has stated, and he recognizes the deficiency of that definition.
And you also have, and you have people
larger question is,
excuse me, but you
cannot wrap this debate. David, let me just make a statement. I don't think we can wrap this debate about the issue under this hoary notion that somehow it is racist, McCarthyism, or that people who give to hospitals will somehow be sentenced to 10-year terms. It addresses a very particular issue of the danger of foreign groups in the United States masquerading under false cover. And that's why part of the bill was introduced. We have to recognize that when the head of the CIA says that militant Islamic groups have created an infrastructure in the United States from which they recruit and raise funds and also have developed terrorist cells, that is not something that is racist or McCarthyite. That's a fact of life. It doesn't reflect upon the larger Muslim community any way than the JDL's existence reflects upon the larger Jewish community.
Domestic,
The-
he's surveilling domestic
The
organizations?
director of the
CIA is?
The acting director of the CIA said that terrorist groups in the United States have recruited and raised funds here, and belong to the transnational militant Islamic
when they
group.
arrested the LA-8, the 7 Palestinians and the Kenyan woman, there was a huge press release. They said they had broken a terrorist ring. They called them terrorists. It isn't helpful to use that term. If they were bombers, and there was evidence that they were looking to blow something up, they should have been accused of violating those laws.
Being bombers,
Right, that's right. But they called them terrorists. Now, at the end of the day, the only thing that they were able to show is that they were distributing leaflets in support of the PFLN. The only thing. They were distributing leaflets. And their own documents, when it came out in litigation, showed that the intention of the whole business was to disrupt the political activity, which is the same thing that went on in the 60s. You remember all of the claims about the violence of the Black Panthers. Some of the Black Panthers were violent, but at the end of the day, the FBI had done more violence to the Black Panthers than the Black Panthers did to anyone else. They trumped up charges, they labeled people terrorists, they used other words, but there is really good reason to be skeptical of these broad terms that don't have any definition. If somebody is plotting to blow up a building, current law already prohibits that, and we should all be happy if the FBI gets to the bottom of it before it happens and catches people quickly after it happens.
Well, I'd like to ask Professor Coe, if there was absolutely no sign of terrorism in the situation described by Mr. Glasser, how do they dare use that term? I mean, the prosecution.
They use that term extremely loosely. The INS claims that anyone who is associated with or distributes leaflets for or supports an organization that has engaged in terrorist activity is a terrorist. Even if all that person is doing, even if there's no dispute that that organization engages in a wide range of lawful social activities, and all that person is doing is supporting the lawful activities. The use of the word terrorism today, I think, is precisely analogous to the use of the word communist in the 50s.
To the use of the word subversive.
It's a focus not on what individuals are doing themselves, but on who they're associating with. The LA-8 are not accused of doing any illegal violent act or supporting any illegal violent act. What they're accused of doing is associating with and supporting an organization which engages in both lawful and unlawful activity.
The case in the LA-8 is not over. The case is not over, and there still will be evidence that the government will be submitting. So I don't think we can make conclusions about the ultimate disposition of the case.
The government has now turned over to us all the evidence.
Having spoken.
The Attorney General under Franklin Delano Roosevelt was instructed to declare certain organizations as on his list of organizations that were, what was the term they used? Subversive. Yeah.
Subversive activities.
Now, there was no penalty attached to people who were members of that organization, but the idea was to alert the community to the aims of those organizations, which had nothing to do with the enlarging civil rights. They had to do with following orders as issued by Moscow. Now, I simply disagree with whoever it was that said that people just randomly called other people communists during the 50s. The answer is they did not.
No, but on the question of terrorism, I'd like to ask Victoria, isn't it a little odd to say there's this terrible special problem called terrorism, which requires special legislation, a new shifting of the balance between civil liberties and law enforcement, because of the nature of the threat called terrorism, and then say, but we can't have a definition of terrorism that doesn't include virtually every crime in this bill. We're going to leave that to the discretion of the Attorney General, because we can't define what terrorism is.
No, we can define exactly what it is. I'm saying that in the criminal statute that is used to prosecute a person, that criminal statute is where we get the elements of the crime. You know that.
What is terrorism?
A crime for purposes of achieving a political end.
So
but no, wait a minute.
You're willing to acknowledge that there are good guy terrorists.
No, because
you would admit that the Contras, for example, were terrorists.
Well, the resistance to the Nazis in France were terrorists.
The attempt
I applauded them.
During the 1980s, when we had this debate about international terrorism, there was an attempt by the people pushing this to distinguish between good guys, freedom fighters, the Contras, who of course were not terrorists, and terrorism, based on their means, not on their ends, which seemed to me to be a totally futile endeavor.
Bill,
But
but
that was true. But when I was in the United Nations as a delegate, I was on the committee that tried to pass an anti-terrorist resolution, and it was impossible to do so because there were too many third world countries who said, you can't call my people terrorists, they're freedom fighters. So this simply becomes a matter of semantics.
Right.
However, I'd be perplexed to be instructed that difficulty occupies us in Los Angeles. But I understand you'd be saying that it does.
Absolutely, and a federal judge has
And not
found that
only
it
the 8
does.
who were arrested and whose lives have been disrupted now for many years. I mean, it's 7 years now, and tremendous legal fees and tremendous pain to them and their families, but also to hundreds of others who are brought in routinely for questioning or who are harassed. And I say racist, and I mean it because I think that there's a targeting of Palestinians in this country that is partly political, but is partly born of a certain amount of bigotry against them because they are viewed as an unpopular ethnic group in this country. And I think it's wrong. And I think that what this legislation does
You mean
is
by
it opens the
non-Jewish
door-
people? This animosity you're talking about that's distinctively attached to the Palestinians.
Oh, I think that it's Palestinian because they're Arab. In some cases, they're Muslim, and in every case because they have a political ideology that opposes the government of Israel, and that has made them an unpopular group and fair game for a whole lot of people.
You mean because there's no Democrats in the Arab world? Is that why?
Oh, it's not true that there's no Democrats in the Arab world.
Where are
who
they?
knows why? I mean, the
And
same
what's
thing
that
happened
got
in-
to do with it anyway?
the same
Why
thing-
should that
I'm
persecute
trying
people
to
in Los
understand
Angeles?
why there is this hostility that you speak of.
Because it has to do with this notion of the other. It has happened throughout all of our history with immigrant groups who, at the time, people felt strange and threatened by. It happened against the French before the Alien and Sedition Acts. It happened against the Germans and Italians before the Palmer raids.
Has it happened against the Mexicans?
Yes.
Yes.
It has
I
happened
have
against the
to,
Mexicans.
I have to thank you all very much. Thank you.
Next week on Firing Line, host William F. Buckley Jr. and his guests conclude their discussion of the pros and cons of the new anti-terror bill. This program was a Warren Steibel production in association with South Carolina ETV. Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support was provided by the Annenberg Foundation and the Friends of Firing Line. For information about a video cassette of this program, write to Firing Line, 2700 Cypress Street, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205, or call 803-799-3449. That's Firing Line, 2700 Cypress Street, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205, or call 803-799-3449.